When we think of William Shakespeare, we usually think of the plays, the sonnets, and the sheer weight of the English language. But the name itself carries a history that is just as complex and dramatic as any of his tragedies. In her study of the poet's family, Charlotte Stopes takes us away from the stage and into the dusty legal records and parish registers of 16th-century England. She isn't just looking for a family tree, she's looking for the social engine that produced the man. The story starts with the name itself. The etymology of Shakespeare is a bit of a puzzle, but it suggests something related to feats of arms or heraldry. In the centuries before the poet was born, the name wasn't tied to a single person or a specific place. It was scattered across England, appearing in Gloucestershire, Kent, and beyond. You find it held by people from every corner of the social ladder, from high-status prioresses to common weavers and even felons. But by the time we reach the 16th century, the name begins to cluster. It settles in Warwickshire, specifically around Wroxall, Rowington, and Snitterfield. This concentration provides the first real clue to the poet's origins. He wasn't an accident of history, he was the product of a very specific, very local movement of people. As the family moved into the 16th century, a clear pattern of social climbing begins to emerge. This is the story of a family trying to move from the working class into the ranks of the gentle people, the minor nobility. The central figure in this climb was John Shakespeare, the poet's father. John was a man of significant ambition and, at times, significant volatility. He was a prosperous glover and a man of civic importance, eventually serving as the High Bailiff of Stratford. But social standing in the Tudor era wasn't just about how much money you had in your pocket, it was about lineage and the symbols you could claim. This is where the pursuit of heraldry comes in. John Shakespeare was determined to formalise the family's upward mobility by applying for a coat of arms. This wasn't just vanity, it was a legal necessity for anyone wanting to be treated as a gentleman. Much of this drive likely came from his marriage to Mary Arden. Mary came from a much higher social standing than the Shakespeares. Her family, the Ardens of Park Hall, were established gentlefolk. By marrying into the Arden line, John wasn't just finding a wife, he was attempting to anchor his family to a respected pedigree. However, this attempt to climb the social ladder was fraught with legal and financial danger. The book highlights a fascinating tension in the Shakespeare history, the gap between how a family presented itself and the reality of its finances. While John was striving to be seen as a gentleman, the family was often embroiled in messy, expensive legal battles. One of the most significant was the struggle over the Asbies estate. This was a piece of land that the Shakespeares believed they had a claim to through the Arden inheritance, but the legal reality was much more complicated. They found themselves in a protracted battle with the well-connected Lambert family. Despite their efforts, legal technicalities and the sheer cost of litigation meant that the property eventually slipped from the family's grasp. This pattern defined John Shakespeare's later years. He went from a prosperous civic leader to a man plagued by debt and legal disputes. There are records of him seeking tax exemptions because of his poverty, a sharp fall for a man who had once held such high office in Stratford. It's a reminder that in the 16th century, social mobility was a high-stakes gamble. You could rise quickly, but without deep-rooted wealth or ancient connections, you could fall just as fast. This atmosphere of precariousness is the backdrop of William Shakespeare's own life. We see him emerging from this environment, a young man with a name that carried both promise and the baggage of legal uncertainty. His marriage to Anne Hathaway was itself a subject of complexity. While the exact details of their union have been debated by historians for centuries, the records show a marriage that was deeply intertwined with the legal and social realities of the time. William eventually moved to London, leaving the shadow of the Warwickshire trades behind. His life in the city was a transition from what might be called a common player to a man of immense literary wealth and status. With the publication of works like Venus and Adonis, he wasn't just a writer, he was an author with aristocratic connections, a man who had successfully navigated the very social ladder his father had spent his life trying to climb. He achieved the stability and the gentle status that his father had sought, but he did so through intellect and art rather than through land and heraldry. Yet, for all his success in London, the biological reality of the Shakespeare family tells a much more sombre story. While William built a massive literary empire, his direct biological line was remarkably short-lived. The tragedy of his personal life is reflected in the survival of his children. His only son, Hamnet, died young, a loss that left a void in the family's future. His daughter Judith had children, but they also died in infancy. The direct lineage of the poet eventually came to a quiet, definitive end with his granddaughter, Elizabeth Barnard. When she died in 1669 without any children of her own, the biological thread of the Shakespeare bloodline was extinguished. It is a striking irony that the name Shakespeare became a global phenomenon, spreading to every corner of the world, even as the actual blood of the man who made it famous vanished from the earth. The name survived, but the people did not. This leads us to where the family's story actually continues, through the collateral branches. While the direct male line ended, the family's reach was wider than just William and his immediate descendants. The book traces the descendants of his sister, Joan, who married into the Hart family. It also follows various branches of the family that settled in London, Oxford, and Essex. In London, the name continued to evolve, moving from the trades of ropemakers and other craftsmen into the upper echelons of the British Empire. The name appeared among aldermen and officers in the East India Company. The name became a brand, a marker of identity, and a legacy that belonged to everyone, even as the biological connection to the man from Stratford grew more distant. Looking back at the family as a whole, we can see several major themes that define this era of English history. First, there is the sheer volatility of social mobility. The Shakespeares were new-found gentles, and their story shows how difficult it was to bridge the gap between the rising merchant class and the established nobility. Heraldry served as a kind of social currency, a way to buy into a status that the law required, but that the bank account often couldn't support. There was also a profound discrepancy between property and blood. The Shakespeares were very successful at acquiring status and even property, like New Place in Stratford, but they couldn't sustain the biological continuity required to keep a dynasty alive. They achieved the gentle life that John Shakespeare had dreamed of, but they couldn't pass it on. Finally, the book highlights the sheer difficulty of tracing these lives. The 16th century is a time of genealogical ambiguity. Names were spelled differently from one parish to the next, and common names like Shakespeare or Arden make it incredibly difficult to be certain which person in a record is the one we are looking for. Much of what we know is built on circumstantial evidence, land records, court cases, and tax rolls, rather than a clear, unbroken line of birth and death certificates. In the end, the history of the Shakespeare family is not just a genealogy. It is a study of the tension between ambition and reality. It is the story of a family that fought hard to be seen as something more than they were. A family that climbed through the social ranks only to find that the higher you go, the harder it is to hold on. William Shakespeare may have left the world with a language that belongs to all of us, but his own family's story is a much more human, much more fragile tale of rise, fall, and eventual disappearance. The name remains, echoing through history, but the people who carried it are gone, leaving us to piece together their lives from the fragments they left behind in the archives.